From the historic campus of Hillsdale College in Hillsdale, Michigan, where the good, the true, and the beautiful are taught, nurtured, and honored, this is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour, bringing the activity and education of the college to listeners across the country.
I find it amusing that anyone would propose moving elections to a single day after the impetus, particularly on the left, has been to stretch out the election process over weeks of early voting. And, you know, that may have been a factor in the elections process in 2020.
This is your host, Scot Bertram. Welcome to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour, part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. That was Dr. Kevin Portteus, Professor of Politics and Director of American Studies at Hillsdale College. We talk with him today about the how and why we nominate our presidential candidates in the way that we do. Dr. Portteus, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
It's good to have you back. Today we talk about the how and the why and the history of the way we get our presidential nominees as that season is coming upon us very quickly. We go way back. The Constitution itself is silent on not the nominating process for candidates. The framers didn't really anticipate political parties developing, in fact. So how did this process emerge in the early days of the country?
Well, as you point out, the founders hadn't really anticipated that there would be a parties or a partisan system. And so as parties developed in the 1790s, ultimately what you ended up with was a system whereby an organization or a party, and the parties at this time were nothing like the parties we have today. They were very Congress-centered. They were not grassroots. The members of Congress from the Federalist and Democratic Republican parties would get together in what was called a caucus, and they would select presidential candidates, especially the Democratic Republican Party. They had a very heavy emphasis on this. And that lasted really up through James Monroe. And then it began to break down, and you started to get the development of a more modern party system with a more bottom-up organization.
Since the presidency of Andrew Jackson or so, party conventions have been the avenue through which candidates for president are chosen. How do those conventions function maybe prior to that? And when did we begin to transition to the use of state primaries and state caucuses?
Well, from about the 1830s on, you began to have these conventions at all levels, local, state, federal. And it was really kind of a representative process whereby more local parties would select candidates and write platforms at the local level, and then send delegates to a state convention. And the state convention would do the same thing, and then it would elect delegates to send to a national convention from that state. And so what you got was a process whereby the party membership was indirectly represented in the national conventions, and they would meet. And sometimes those delegates would be pledged to a particular candidate, and sometimes they wouldn't be. But oftentimes that pledging only lasted for one ballot. And so if the first ballot did not produce a winner, then the delegates were released and could vote their own consciences, could make deals, whatever they had to do. The transition to a primary system is actually very slow and gradual. You get your first primaries around the beginning of the 20th century, and it was very much a progressive reform. The progressives believed that the convention system was too boss-dominated, too insider-dominated, and their goal was to make the political system more closely tied to and more accountable to the people.
If we move forward through the 20th century and look toward the 1968 Democratic Convention, remembered for a number of different reasons, but it also helped to transform the process for nominating the president. How so?
Well, over the course of the first two-thirds of the 20th century, you had a kind of hybrid system. A few states used the primary system, but most did not. And those primaries were not necessarily binding on delegates from those states. So it was more of a preference primary, and it might influence what the delegates do at convention, but it didn't necessarily bind them. And so, for instance, in 1912, Theodore Roosevelt won the few primaries in the Republican Party that existed at that time, but the convention then renominated William Howard Taft. And so this was the impetus for TR to break away and form the Progressive Party, which of course was ultimately defeated, but probably helped to elect Woodrow Wilson as a Democrat. By 1968, about a third of states used primaries. And in the Democratic Party, those states were overwhelmingly won by Bobby Kennedy. But at the end of the day, the nomination went to Hubert Humphrey in a kind of settlement at the convention. This was a very contested convention. It was a very tumultuous convention with riots and police involvement. And the Democratic Party took notice. And so they appointed a commission initially under George McGovern and then later under Congressman Donald Fraser, which recommended reforms to the process, and specifically that the process should be, quote, open, timely, and representative. And that really was the catalyst for the transformation from a few states having non-binding primaries to most, if not all, states using binding primaries, and eventually reinstituting the winner-take-all system that most states or many states employ today.
The system that essentially we have today, one of the most notable dates is what's called Super Tuesday. What is that for those who might not know, and how did that important date on the calendar originate and evolve?
Well, elections in the United States are traditionally held on Tuesdays, starting with the date set for presidential elections under the Constitution. For general elections under the Constitution, of course, the Constitution takes no notice of primary elections. But you began to have states grouping themselves together in order to maximize their influence in the process. And this is something that's happened very irregularly because, again, at the state level, primary dates shift. They're not set permanently in the way that, say, a general presidential election is set by constitutional law. And so over time, you sometimes you'll have two, you'll have three, but these simply Super Tuesday simply indicates a day when a number of states have their primaries at the same time. And this is something that really got rolling in the 1980s. And eventually in that process, particularly southern states began to pool themselves together in order to maximize their influence, but it's become more than that. And so again, you may have 1, 2, even 3 of these Super Tuesdays, but the idea is these are dates when a lot of delegates are decided all at once.
Talking with Dr. Kevin Portteus about the how and the why and how it evolved, how we choose our presidential candidates for president. So in designing the calendar of the primary, how much say does the party itself have? Do the states themselves have any influence on where they are placed inside this primary schedule?
Yeah, it's a complicated process, and it varies greatly by state because the parties at the national level seek to establish a primary schedule. But ultimately, decisions about when primary elections, like all other elections in a state, will be held are set by state law. Now, states tend to go with what the party wants. Of course, the Democrats and the Republicans overwhelmingly control the state governments, and so there's a relationship there. But it's not automatic that the state simply does whatever it wants, and the parties themselves don't simply have control over the process. There's a back and forth there in that decision making.
In 2016, perhaps most notably that year, the Democratic Party got caught up in a controversy or discussion surrounding the superdelegates. What are superdelegates? Why did only the Democratic Party have them, and what's their current role in that system?
So the superdelegates arose as a result of concerns among Democratic Party insiders about the reforms that were implemented as a result of the McGovern-Fraser Commission. The McGovern-Fraser Commission put the nominating process very much in the hands of the party's activist class and of its voting base. And there was concern there that decisions were not being made on the basis of factors like electability. And so in the mid-1970s, the Democratic Party instituted the superdelegate feature, which basically means that a certain percentage of the delegates to the convention are essentially party insiders. So if you're a member of Congress from the Democratic Party, if you are a former or sitting vice president, you have one of these seats. If you are a member of the Democratic National Committee, right? If you're one of these insiders, you have the inside track to these slots, and the number varies, but it's basically about 15 to 20%. And the concern in 2016 was that the superdelegates were all throwing in behind Hillary Clinton and making it very, very difficult for anyone to challenge from the grassroots, in this case, Bernie Sanders, whom the party wanted. And so there were some reforms after 2016. The Democrats had a commission, 2017, 2018, and they reduced the number of superdelegates somewhat, but they also decided that superdelegates would not vote on the first ballot in the convention, so that superdelegates are now only going to become an issue if the first ballot does not produce a winner, and that first ballot is dominated by the results of the primary process.
Are those superdelegates the only significant way in which the two major parties sort of differ in the way that they nominate those candidates these days?
Well, the Republicans do have some seats set aside for party insiders, a few per state, but the number is far less in the Republican Party. And so they have proven to be less of an issue. And the Republican Party primary processes have not been as close as the Democrats were necessarily in 2016. Even in 2016 for the Republicans, by the time you got to the end of that process, it was Trump and Ted Cruz, and Trump was clearly ahead. And so they weren't poised to be a decisive factor.
Talking with Dr. Kevin Portteus about the why and the how we nominate our candidates for president. This cycle, the Democrats have changed the primary calendar, replacing Iowa, which recently has been first, with South Carolina. Why would they do something like that? What's the significance of a change like that in the process?
Yeah, they've actually moved to limit the importance of both Iowa and New Hampshire. And the White House itself has promoted South Carolina and Georgia. Now, of course, South Carolina was the state that put Biden in the driver's seat in 2020. Biden's campaign was not doing great up until that point, but scored a very decisive victory in South Carolina. And I think the reason for the biggest reason for that change is that by Democratic Party standards, Iowa and New Hampshire are simply unrepresentative. Iowa is going increasingly red. It's joining Ohio in that sense and becoming a more decisively Republican state. But I think more importantly, in both cases, those two states are overwhelmingly white. And that means that they are not representative. And South Carolina and Georgia are more diverse in that regard. And so, again, by Democratic Party standards, that means that they are more representative of the Democratic Party's electorate and signifying the importance, as the Biden people understand, of the black vote in driving Biden's nomination.
Not to get too technical here, but I mean, New Hampshire or Iowa, the states themselves could say, well, forget that. We're still going to go first. But the parties that have mechanisms to punish those states, generally with taking away or lessening the delegates they have available to pledge at the convention, right?
Yeah, and that's a double-edged sword because parties do have that weapon, which is to say they can look at Iowa's delegates and say, you know what? You're not going to count as much because you broke our rules, right? The Iowa state caucus process broke Democratic Party rules. We said South Carolina was going to go first. You decided you were going to go first anyway. The other side of that is that parties are loath to sort of diminish delegates from a particular state or to not certify delegates or to do anything like that that's going to open up the party to the charge that they are being unrepresentative. So there's a little bit of a mutual assured destruction aspect to it, which is to say the state and the parties, right, each of them have cards to play, but there's sort of risks involved on either side. And so the parties tried, especially recently, to try and use that mechanism, but ultimately it did not prove particularly successful.
there's been some discussion or conversation, or at least proposals to move to a single day national primary. States who vote later, those voters say, well, by the time we vote, the candidate we want is gone. It's already decided. Are there any advantages to, say, the parties themselves to say, okay, let's do it all on a day across the country? And would it be better for our elections overall as a country to say we're all going to do this together on the same day?
Well, at least as far as the general election was concerned, that was the idea. And so I find it amusing that anyone would propose moving elections to a single day after the impetus, particularly on the left, has been to stretch out the election process over weeks of early voting. And, that may have been a factor in the elections process in 2020, because there are people out there who cast their vote early, and then, additional information comes out, but it's already too late for them. And so, I can see the value if you're going to select your candidates by primary. I can certainly see the value of doing it nationwide on a certain day. That way, all of the voters in one party or the other are making their decisions based on a common set of information. But it's never going to happen in practice because, again, with early voting and vote by mail, the idea of voting on a single day is just disintegrating in principle nationwide.
Dr. Kevin Portteus, Professor of Politics and Director of American Studies here at Hillsdale College, as we talk about the way we nominate our candidates for president. Dr. Portteus, thanks so much for joining us here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Thank you.
Up next, we talk with J. Michael Waller. His brand new book is Big Intel: How the CIA and FBI Went from Cold War Heroes to Deep State Villains. I'm Scot Bertram. This is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Great books, great people, and great ideas. Knowledge of these things is critical to becoming a well-educated human being. That's why I'd like to tell you about an easy and enjoyable way for you to listen and learn whenever and wherever you want. And that's through the Hillsdale Dialogues. If you haven't heard about the Dialogues, once a week, Hillsdale College President Larry Arnn joins radio veteran Hugh Hewitt to discuss topics of enduring relevance. From time to time, they also talk about current events, but always with an eye toward more fundamental truths. And they want you to listen in, to join a conversation like no other. The Hillsdale Dialogues are posted every Friday on podcast.hillsdale.edu. That's podcast.hillsdale.edu, or wherever you get your audio.
Welcome back to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. I'm Scot Bertram. Be sure to follow the show on X, formerly Twitter. We're at Hillsdale Radio. We're joined now by J. Michael Waller. He is a senior analyst for strategy at the Center for Security Policy and president of Georgetown Research, a private intelligence company in Washington, D.C. Also extensive contacts with the FBI and CIA, and an asset for the CIA for a time. He'll tell us more about his experience momentarily. The brand new book is out now, Big Intel: How the CIA and FBI Went from Cold War Heroes to Deep State Villains. Michael, thanks so much for joining us.
It's great to be with you, Scott.
I briefly mentioned your background, Michael, but when people pick up the book, they will understand the detail of the reporting and writing that went into Big Intel and the history of these organizations. What is your background in intelligence, the FBI, the CIA, to be able to write something like this?
Well, my background's a kind of unusual one because people who knew me when I was just starting out in college thought that I didn't have the temperament to fit into a bureaucracy, and that I was too conservative to be welcome in one. And in the words of the great Angelo Codavilla, he was a Senate staffer then, he told me, "You will hate them and they will hate you." So I ended up being an asset for CIA Director Bill Casey when I was still a college student down during the wars in Central America. So that was my entry into the intelligence world. And even though I was never part of the machine itself, I worked with it and around it for quite a long time.
As I mentioned, Big Intel is a bit of a history of these organizations, and we don't have the time right now to go into all those details, but people will find that when they pick up the book. Where does Where did the FBI and the CIA begin? What causes their creation? And sort of what is the initial goal of those organizations?
Well, the FBI was created by a bureaucratic fiat to respond to anarchist terrorism and to certain crimes that were not handled by the states. And so you had, President McKinley was assassinated by anarchists. Teddy Roosevelt was shot. You had bombings, all sorts of waves of terrorism here in the early 1900s. And so the Bureau of Investigation was created, later became a Federal Bureau of Investigation. But its first big work was really to hunt down communist radicals and deport undesirable foreigners.
Big Intel is the new book from J. Michael Waller, How the CIA and FBI Went from Cold War Heroes to Deep State Villains. People who know the FBI or know a little about the FBI certainly know the name J. Edgar Hoover. You spend time on him in the book. Tell us how Hoover helped shape the organization, and also you say that he saw a little of these present day problems coming. How so?
Hoover warned about this. He was almost a prophet in a political sense. He really was. When he was in his 20s, he was put in charge of what was called the Radical Division of the Justice Department, and that was to hunt down communists and anarchists, and because he could see what was happening. So when he was in his 20s, he was running raids, he was running, setting up databases and all of these other things to start out to enable our country to defend itself internally. This was right after World War I. And so when he was put in charge of the Bureau of Investigation, he built upon that. And the Bureau's job was really to stop communist and other subversive infiltration of our country from abroad. So he could see coming what we now have thrust on us, which is this critical theory, cultural Marxism, penetration of all of our institutions by Marxists and people who don't believe in the American way of life. And he was warning about this he was warning about it 100 years ago.
You say in Big Intel that diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, is now essentially standard ideology through the FBI and CIA. What do you mean by that, and how has it affected the operations?
Yes, DEI was declared mission critical. That's the term, mission critical, by the FBI and CIA, meaning that DEI is a core of the mission of the FBI and of our whole, not just the CIA, but the whole intelligence community. This was a gradual infiltration, kind of like if you let rust take over your car without treating it. And you don't notice it at first, and then you think you'll take care of it later, and you don't notice till the thing starts falling apart that it's actually fallen apart, and it's really too late to fix it. And that's what's happened with the FBI and CIA, where the CIA was always a liberal institution, but it was still anti-communist. It was still pro-American. FBI generally leaned somewhat conservative, but was generally, with exceptions, apolitical. But then when DEI or the elements of DEI started creeping in, it started under George W. Bush after 9/11, but it really took force when Barack Obama issued executive orders to make DEI part of the operating system of the entire U.S. government, including the intelligence community. So it was the Office of Director of National Intelligence, Clapper, and CIA Director Brennan, who really imposed it with a vengeance on the whole intelligence community.
Was this an active or passive change in the organizations? Meaning, was someone or someone's pushing for these changes throughout the organizations, or did it happen because no one stepped up to stop it?
It was both. It started out from below, where you had sort of small cell groups organizing at the lower levels among different agencies and in the private sector, came straight out of the universities. But those small cell groups really had nowhere to go and nowhere to advance until there was somebody at the top to pull them up. And that's when the Obama team came in and pulled them up from below. So they already had their different identity group cells at the lower level. Those people were then elevated to become supervisors and administrators and top managers. But for the most part, you had Republicans and conservatives looking the other way. They didn't want to see it. They didn't want to deal with it. Nothing was done. So straight from Trump to Obama to Bush to Biden, you have a continuum that was uninterrupted.
You quote extensively in Big Intel, the new book from J. Michael Waller, from training sessions about pronouns and transgender rules, and even becoming advocates for those sorts of efforts. How do they make the connection? You mentioned earlier it's mission critical. How do they make that connection between these things and the actual missions of the organizations?
Well, the CIA framed it as what they called, and they even had a hashtag for it, agents of change. So these are no longer intelligence officers to run operations abroad against foreign adversaries. They're no longer straight intelligence analysis to inform our leaderships. They're active agents of change to lead the way, as the Office of the Director of National Intelligence put it, lead the way to transform the country. So it's really an internal intelligence operation illegally being deployed against the American population, starting in about 2011.
What tangible results or what tangible changes do you think we've seen from these new efforts inside the FBI, CIA? How do we know it's affected their work?
Oh, it severely affected their morale. I interviewed a lot of former agents and analysts and others who didn't want to be named for fear of retribution, but they left out of sheer demoralization. I talked to a former station chief in a very significant country where we had a lot of conflicts in the area, and he quit before his retirement time because he just couldn't stand it anymore. This was a case where you're being disciplined because you're using the wrong pronouns. That your promotions are weighted on whether or not you are a good DEI agent of change, whether you're a good, quote, ally of LGBTQ, or whatever other letters that they add on it. You have to be ideologically in conformity with this new political culture that's been imposed. And if you're not, you won't get that promotion.
J. Michael Waller is with us. His new book is Big Intel, How the CIA and FBI Went from Cold War Heroes to Deep State Villains. The last portion of Big Intel is recommendations on how to fix the FBI and CIA. And you begin that section by saying, we can do it because it's been done before. What can we learn from the past?
Well, here's the thing: the CIA and the FBI have these brands, and that we can't get rid of the CIA. We can't get rid of they're so important. No, they're just bureaucracies. They're just brands. One's an agency. It's like the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, or the Bureau of Indian Affairs, or Bureau of Land Management. Well, the other's just a bureau, which is even lower on the totem pole than an agency. So we can make things different, the way it was done right after World War II, where the OSS was dissolved, the Office of Strategic Services, because it had been so compromised in large part, and something new, the CIA, was created in its place with a carefully planned grand strategy that had bipartisan support. This was during the Truman administration, and it worked really well during the Cold War overall. We can do that again. We didn't do it after 9/11. It was just President Bush just slapped together a giant Department of Homeland Security and centralized all the intelligence agencies. We had 17 of them separate so that none of them would get too powerful. He centralized them to make a huge, giant, powerful one, Department of Homeland Security plus ODNI. So we had two centralized ones. Those haven't worked very well, and they have made things easy to politicize, which is how Obama was able to do it with his executive orders. So history shows we can take these apart and take the important functions and transfer them to existing agencies that already perform those functions, or have a lot smaller, leaner, much more effective intelligence community that serves the national interest without abusing the public.
And in the end, who's responsible for cleaning this up? Is it a future president and his administration? Is it Congress? Who needs to get the job done?
The president needs to take the lead, and then Congress needs to enact it as law.
A final question for J. Michael Waller, whose new book is Big Intel. Your subhead on the title, Deep State Villains. I guess I want to ask, are these agencies as they operate today still a net positive for America and its security?
Most of them are. most of them can be tweaked, or you need some laws to regulate how they behave. The problem is really the FBI, because that affects us all in our day-to-day lives. And then the CIA, which has just become too big, too clumsy, and too politicized, and too inefficient. So if you take care of those two, the others still have a lot of use. And the FBI still has a lot of important roles in interstate crime, in counterintelligence. It does not do a good job in counterintelligence, in certain things relating to counterterrorism. If it's forced to be held really accountable for its actions, its constituent pieces can really serve the national interest. But right now, when they consider really half the population of the country to be potential extremists, you have a problem, and something has to be done about it.
J. Michael Waller, Senior Analyst for Strategy at the Center for Security Policy, President of Georgetown Research, and his new book is Big Intel, How the CIA and FBI Went from Cold War Heroes to Deep State Villains, a great history of intelligence in the country, and then a look at what's happening today. Michael, thanks so much for joining us here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Scott, it was great to be here.
Up next, we talk with Haley Strack, a 2023 graduate of Hillsdale College and a William F. Buckley Fellow in Political Journalism at National Review. I'm Scot Bertram. This is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Hey there! Today I want to tell you about the Hillsdale K-12 Classical Education Podcast. This unique show explains how children benefit from an American classical education. Whether you're a teacher, student, or parent, you'll find something of value on the show. You'll hear from teachers and administrators from schools around the country, as well as Hillsdale professors and friends who are leading the effort to revive the American tradition of K-12 education. When you listen, you'll learn all about classical education, what it is, how to teach it, and why it matters today. And there are dozens of back episodes on specific topics, like teaching Singapore math, reading great books, and even understanding how athletics is critical to a child's development. Listen every Monday on podcast.hillsdale.edu. That's podcast.hillsdale.edu, or wherever you find your audio.
Welcome back to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. I'm Scot Bertram. Be sure to check out the Hillsdale College Podcast Network at podcast.hillsdale.edu. Find older episodes of this program plus many other audio shows from Hillsdale at podcast.hillsdale.edu. We're joined now by Haley Strack. She's a 2023 graduate of Hillsdale College and now William F. Buckley Fellow in Political Journalism at National Review. You can find her work at nationalreview.com. Haley, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Mr. Bertram.
Somehow after graduation, you found yourself at National Review and then found yourself writing a series of stories and essays in what I would call the energy and mining beat, somewhat unexpected coming from Hillsdale. And it all started with a trip down into a uranium mine. What was that like, and how did that happen?
Yes, somehow, by the grace of God, I find myself at National Review and then 1,500 feet underground in Arizona. We have a longtime reader who manages an energy fuels resources mine. He is a, communications director. So he reached out to the newspaper and a news editor. I'm a few months into the job here at National Review. A news editor sent the pitch over to me and said, this seems like something you'd be interested in. He's a lovely news editor, great guy, but it was not, in fact, something I did think I'd be interested in. But, I'm new to the job. I'll try out anything. I would love to know something about energy, especially as the world certainly seems oriented towards spending millions, billions of dollars and lots of time and, may I say, energy on clean goals and on renewables in the next or foreseeable future. So I said, okay, let's learn something. I called the Energy Fuels Resources, which is the parent company of Pinyon Plain Mine in Arizona. Energy Fuels has been in operation since the 80s. They were around before that, but they regrouped in the 2000s and geared up for this next fight in rare earths and critical minerals. They were saying, we're ready to get back into the game. And so Curtis Moore of Energy Fuels Resources let me know that President Joe Biden was planning on declaring a national monument in Arizona, somewhat outside of the Grand Canyon. Anyone who's been there knows the value of that land. The Grand Canyon is beautiful. This trip to the mine was the first time I've been myself, and I'm from California. But Grand Canyon National Park, the land surrounding, is gorgeous land. So, of course, any mining operations that might be going on in that land have always raised some red flags. We don't want anything to happen in the Grand Canyon. There are lots of Native American tribes around that area who have protested land designation for a while, or who have advocated for land designation for quite some time. So President Joe Biden was seeking to declare a new monument outside of the already millions of acres of land that the Grand Canyon National Monument protects. And of course, Energy Fuels having a mine in this area, they were alarmed by this designation. What Joe Biden wanted to do, and what he has in fact now done, what he completed in August, is cut off millions of acres of land to some of the United States' richest uranium deposits, which is a problem.
Yeah, you wrote about that, and then you wrote also about a threat in Utah as well to uranium mining there. We talk about energy independence, why does squeezing our access to uranium affect it?
So our uranium control, our uranium production, our uranium refinement capability, they pale in comparison to other foreign counterparts that we are now competing with, not only in national defense, but also in energy and security. So Russia and China right now hold market dominance for both rare earths, critical minerals. So everything from uranium to the materials we need to produce lithium-ion batteries for electric vehicles, which, if you know anything about Joe Biden's recent campaigns, we're pushing electric vehicles like mad people. We want electric vehicles, but we have a very convoluted approach as to how to get there. Electric vehicles require massive amounts of energy, massive amounts of minerals that the United States absolutely has in land deposits, but has no capability to mine. A part of the reason why is because, decades ago, Russia, China, Uzbekistan, all of these places figured out that they could mine for very cheap. They could drive down market prices. In the United States, we love capitalism. We do love free trade, and we seize the opportunity to go outsource all of these markets and all of the rare earths we would need to places that could produce them for cheaper. There are a few problems with that. First, these places don't produce minerals in a safe way. This has been something I struggled with myself. I love bashing government regulations. Federal regulations are typically not good, especially for a Hillsdale audience. I think we all realize that a limited government is a good government. But part of what makes regulations in U.S. mining, as I saw in Arizona, so spectacular is that we really care about the safety of miners after the Soviet era, catastrophes that we saw in mines, in which many miners, a lot of whom were Native American themselves, many miners would get awful lung cancer. Mine shafts would collapse. There was just recently a mine shaft collapse, I think, in Africa. And you can see just the tremendous capability of these mines to do real harm if they're not regulated, if they're not protected. And how you think the regulatory apparatus should handle that is maybe a different question. But there is no doubt that these places that we now buy our minerals from are just very dangerous. The second problem, though, is that, it's a national defense concern. We are now competing with Russia in the Russia-Ukraine war. If there ever comes a point in time when that war ramps up and we absolutely cannot go and outsource things to Russia, then we need to have some sort of dependence on the domestic market, which we do not. And our refinement capabilities will not be such until about 2030, when, Tesla's various projects that Elon Musk is starting, and I think Texas, and we've got some in the mining belts in Alabama. Once those ramp up, then the U.S. will be in a good spot. But it's going to take a lot of time, and it's going to take a lot of power.
We go from uranium to lithium, and you wrote about a huge lithium deposit found in Nevada. With electric vehicles, need for lithium-ion batteries, you think this would be a big cause for celebration. Was that actually the case?
Unfortunately, no. And I think you can see where this is going with Joe Biden's designation. One thing I want to mention about uranium, because it's similar with lithium, is that in Arizona, the uranium contained in the deposits that Joe Biden cut off are very valuable. And what I mean by that is that they contain like massive tons of ore. They contain massive tons of pure uranium per ton. Same with the lithium deposit in Nevada that we just found. So there are lots of lithium deposits everywhere. And again, the United States has just some of the richest land. You can see that with our national parks. You can see it's a beautiful country. We know this, and with beautiful land. And the lithium deposit that we found in Nevada, not only is it massive, but it contains some of the best lithium we have. Unfortunately, some of the environmentalist groups and some of the Native American tribes that worked their hardest to cut off uranium mining in Arizona, I predict will try to do the same thing in Nevada. We'll see what Joe Biden does now, because lithium is a bit more of a hot button issue, simply because it is named lithium-ion batteries and electric vehicles, right? Uranium is a bit more ambiguous, I would say. We know we need it, but you don't have uranium-ion batteries, and that's not what everyone is talking about right now. So we desperately need lithium. Our world supply, it's predicted to exceed millions more tons in the coming years. And unfortunately, Joe Biden could move to cut off this land again.
And then you write about graphite, and I don't even know why we need graphite, but I read, and it's used for battery paste and things like that. And China is now cracking down on the export of graphite to other places across the country. How will graphite help determine our energy future?
Oh, that is such a good question. Well, this is really the push-pull game with China here. And this is where we can see all of the different energy policies in effect. This is why we can see why we need to reduce our dependence so heavily, because China controls the graphite market. And when I say controls, I really mean control. For lithium, for uranium, there are some other countries that we can go to, Canada namely. But China, I think, altogether with refinement, production, export, they contain maybe more than 90% of the graphite market. So we do need graphite, probably not for things that are as important as, our rockets or our lithium-ion batteries, but we do need graphite. And China just tightened market exports because we're tightening their control on semiconductor chips for national security purposes. We don't want China to have access to these semiconductor chips because they're very powerful. China, in return, cuts off graphite exports to the United States. This is set to go into effect in December. The problem here is that China could very easily do this on every other aspect of the market. China really does control most of the rare earths market. And if they do that, again, the United States does not have the infrastructure to keep up. So we are now trying to shore up some different graphite resources in other places. Unfortunately, if we go to places like Africa for graphite, you get into regional disputes, and you really don't know what'll happen if you seek out graphite in those areas. What I mean by regional disputes is that there are, unfortunately, some active, either terror groups or groups that will seek to undermine what the United States can do in those mines. Again, as I mentioned, it's very unsafe, the mining conditions themselves. And then you have regional groups who come in and want to exploit what the U.S. is doing there. And so you don't know then how dependable that resource will be at the end of the day. You don't know, okay, well, will we have graphite in a few months? Who knows? Because we could not even be able to get to that land. We could not get it exported out. We don't know if people will be, killing each other, which is, it's a very grim situation, and one that the United States is now forced into because of China and because of our own reluctance.
Haley Strack at National Review, a William F. Buckley Fellow in Political Journalism, and for years before that, a member of the Hillsdale College Journalism Department, writing for the Collegian and doing other such things. How did what you learned here in Hillsdale at the Journalism Department prepare you for the energy and mining beat at National Review?
I can't say I was traipsing around Michigan in my 4 years here seeking out any active mines, but I will say that the journalism department in Hillsdale in general attracts and both nurtures a sort of curiosity about the world, about the place you are in. I also, I'm Catholic, and so I have a deep love for everything God does here, and Hillsdale really teaches you to slow down in our little bubble in Hillsdale, Michigan, to slow down and appreciate the world around you. Part of the reason why I love mining so much is that, you could see it as man harvesting land for his own use, But truly, it's a feat, and it's an American feat that we are able to use the land that God has provided us to do wonderful things for technological advancements that have saved millions of lives, that will save millions in the future. And so I think Hillsdale's just overall sense of promoting curiosity, and especially within the journalism department, of responsible curiosity, of wanting to go report on things that are underreported. I think conservative media in general could do more to report on energy and environment, and there are some wonderful people in DC who are doing that. And I hope to continue on this beat. But I can't say enough about just everything that Hillsdale and the journalism department here did for me, despite not sending me to any mines, which maybe they should do in the future.
With some sort of endowed mining position. I'm not sure how that will work. Haley Strack, a 2023 graduate of Hillsdale College and current William F. Buckley Fellow in Political Journalism at National Review. Read everything we talked about at nationalreview.com. Haley, thanks so much for joining us here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Thank you.
That will wrap up this edition of the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. Our thanks to Dr. Kevin Portteus from Hillsdale's Politics Department, J. Michael Waller, and Haley Strack, 2023 graduate of Hillsdale. The Radio Free Hillsdale Hour is recorded at the studios of WRFH, the student-run radio station at Hillsdale College. Remember, you can hear new episodes every week on this station. You also can find extended versions of some of our interviews or listen anytime to the podcast. Find it at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you get your audio. The assistant producer of the program is Sam Lair. Until next week, I'm Scot Bertram, and this has been the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.